In a certain sense, I'd find these authors in the early church and it would go, I think I've experienced something like that. And they're explaining it in a way that makes a lot of sense to me. Today, we try and retreat from society to get away from the battle. We want peace and quiet. The big difference is to the early fathers, the retreat was to go into battle, but the battle was over your soul.
Hi, everyone. Thanks again for tuning in to another episode of the Two Things You Shouldn't Talk About. This is the podcast that talks about religion, politics, and everywhere they intersect. So I'm delighted tonight to be joined by Josh Hoffert. Thank you so much, Josh, for joining me on the show. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to have this conversation with me. And do you want to introduce yourself to people who have never encountered your work before?
Yeah, I'd love to. It's great. It's great to be on the show, Josh. I've been looking at some of your episodes and checking out the two things that you shouldn't talk about. I love the title, by the way. It's just,
I appreciate that.
Yeah,
Thank you.
It's just perfect. Yeah. So.
Well, that's what I'm all about, is going to places where people don't normally want to go. And, I just find the most meaningful conversations aren't, it's not small talk. It's not, sitting around the dinner table talk. It's getting into issues that really affect our lives, but specifically doing it in a way that is helpful, no vitriol, and just actually trying to understand each other. So that's what we're all about here.
Yeah, that's right, and which is awesome. I love that. And so I'm Joshua Hoffert. You can call me Josh. We've got both Joshes on here, so that's great. And were you
can't have too much of a good thing, eh?
That's right. Is your full name Joshua? Is it?
It is, yeah. Yeah.
So were you like I was the kid who was like, don't call me Joshua, I'm Josh. Yeah,
I don't know.
I was pretty adamant about it.
Yeah, I'm not really. I think I just felt left out with all the people that had nicknames. So
that's right. There's no nickname. That's right.
All the James that became Jamies, and all the Johns that became Johnnies, or Jonathans that became Johnnies, or Daniels became Dannies. And I was like, okay, well, I'm Joshua. Let's just go with Josh.
Yeah, that's right.
Or Joshy,
Yeah. So my wife and I run a ministry called Wind Ministries. We started back about 5 years or so ago. And I mean, we can go even further back than that. But my basic background would be having been raised in the vineyard. I'm from California originally. I now live on the east coast of Canada in Prince Edward Island, which is the home of Anne of Green Gables. And that's where all the Irish immigrated over to PEI for sure. So
I spent 2 months in Canada working at a summer sports resort for kids in kind of upstate Ontario.
Okay.
And I just, from walking around stores and going all over the place, I just bumped into so many people who had Irish heritage, which was really cool, and specifically Northern Irish heritage. So I remember in Montreal one time, someone asked me for directions, and I'm like, "You're asking the wrong guy for directions." I've been here for 3 hours, so that But it turned out
you just looked like a local. So
well, the funniest thing is actually, this is a funny story. I was standing outside a chapel, like a Catholic. I don't know if it was a cathedral per se, but it was like a large Catholic church, and which for people that know me is not something I would frequently do as a very staunch Protestant. So I just happened to be standing outside this old Catholic church, and then this Asian couple came over to me, and they saw that the name of the church was in French because it was Montreal, and it was something about I think the translation was Mary, Queen of the World, or Queen of the Earth, something like that. So they asked me, how do you say this in French? What's the correct way of pronouncing it? So I gave them the most BS French pronunciation in the world.
Oh,
and they were
I like this, Josh. Yeah.
So anyway. We're already getting sidetracked, so I'll let you.
So okay, So there we go. Going back, you could tell we'll be fast friends before the show is over.
Yeah.
Right? I was from California, and we were involved in vineyard churches growing up, which would have been a movement started by a man named John Wimber and others, and which really focused on the charismatic expression of Christianity, and so was one of the catalysts for that movement, and that the Jesus People movement that kind of moved into the Vineyard Church eventually, and if you know the history there, but so that was my background in the sense of my upbringing, and I could make it a really long story, but I in my mid-20s, I'm 43 now, in my mid-20s, I was looking at different ministry schools and schools to attend, that kind of stuff, and had come across a ministry called Streams Ministries, which was founded by a man named John Paul Jackson, and which would have been in the charismatic world, right? So that'd be my background. So I attended his school in Canada, and he passed away in 2015. And eventually, I ran the Canadian branch of his ministry. And so the school that I attended was in Western Canada. It's where I met my wife. And it was in being involved with that ministry where I was introduced to probably the two first notable ones were John of the Cross and the Dark Night of the Soul, and Teresa of Avila with the Interior Castles. And those were kind of conversations we had, or they'd be referenced in some of the teaching on contemplative prayer and things like that. And so the way I discovered that my brain works is I didn't really want to hear someone tell me about it. I wanted to know what the original person taught about it. And so I went and picked up John of the Cross's Dark Night of the Soul. I was probably about 26, read the book, and it made no sense to me whatsoever. And but I was fascinated. I really was. And so that was kind of the catalyst that started me on the journey of starting to go, well, what do some of these other expressions within Christianity? You know, that John of the Cross would be a Catholic mystic, right? What do they say? And so I ended up getting a hold of a copy of what's called the Sayings of the Desert Fathers. And the Sayings of the Desert Fathers is from a text called the Apophthegmata Patrum, which means the Sayings of the Fathers. And so the Desert Fathers and the Desert Mothers was a movement in early Christianity from the 3rd to 6th century. And I hadn't heard about any of this stuff growing up. Like it was the kind of the quote unquote saints of the charismatic evangelical church were the prophetic figures that came in the 100 years before, you know. We very much had a developed idea of who was influential and who we listened to and all that kind of stuff. And but in terms of understanding church history, I when I first started expressing an interest before I ever moved to Canada to attend a ministry school or anything like that, one of the first books, I think I have it. It's back there somewhere. One of the first books that was handed to me by my dad when he could tell, oh, this kid's a bit interested now. So he handed me J.N.D. Kelly's Early Christian Doctrine, and and he said to me, you need to keep, this is before iPhones and all that. So he said, you need to keep a dictionary next to your bed when you're reading this, or your desk or whatever when you're reading this, because you'll come across a lot of terms you don't understand.
And you said you were a teenager at this point?
No, I was about 25, 26 at
okay,
that point.
yeah.
Yeah. It's probably about 25, yeah. And so I read through the whole thing and didn't understand it. And he gave me F.F. Bruce's The Spreading Flame and New Testament history, I think, or New Testament Christianity. So those two books. So he was really instrumental, my dad was, in helping me start to formulate how I think about these things, right? It would drive me crazy because I'd ask him questions as I was trying to figure out growing up in the church, this is the funny thing, is you're not necessarily taught who Jesus is on a profound or deep level, you know? And, or you're not taught what the church is about on a profound and deep level. You're kind of given, platitudinal answers, or, in my experience anyway, right, or you get like, oh yeah, Jesus, he's fully God and fully man. But in terms of teasing that out, what does that mean? What are the implications of it? Where does that come from? Why do we think that way? I don't think I heard a single sermon on that. Now, to be fair to my early pastors, I don't necessarily know that I was listening to any of the sermons. So that's,
you know, those kind of questions you tend to get, you know, some illustration of steam, ice, and water or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah. You would get something like that. And, you know, all of those basically end in heresy now, we know, but
yeah. I was just going to say, I remember one time before I even had looked into much theology at all, I was trying to kind of reconcile these things. And someone had said, you know, Jesus says nothing about homosexuality in the New Testament.
Right.
And I was like, well, he did. He said it in the Old Testament, and then people were like, oh, modalist, you can't say that. And I was like, I don't even know what modalism is. I was like, is that not Jesus? And they're like, no, it's God, but it's not Jesus. And I'm like, okay, I get it.
Yeah. So I found that it was lacking for me, my understanding. So I'd ask these questions of my dad, and he would say, well, read this book, read this book, read this book. And I devoured them. I was like, I was really, really wanted to understand. And so eventually ending my way up into Canada, attending ministry school, starting to learn a little bit more about historic Christianity. And I remember one Christmas, this is probably about, it had been early on. I was married so it had been 15 years ago or so. My wife, we were at it's called Chapters up in Canada. It's like Barnes and Noble, big bookstore. And there was a book called Early Christian Mysticism, or Christian Mysticism, The History of Christian Mysticism by Bernard McGinn. And he's done this huge, he's still in the middle of the study. Bernard McGinn's published a whole bunch of books that chronicle the ages of Christian mysticism was taught, all that kind of stuff. So this was kind of his overview. And most of these books are used in college seminaries or in seminaries and colleges, universities, and that kind of stuff. And I remarked in the book section, oh, that looks really interesting. And my wife, apparently doubled back and picked it up for me and gave it to me for Christmas.
Yeah.
And,
there you go. She knows you well.
She did, yeah. So that was another one of those catalytic moments for me, because it would put these snippets out, Julian of Norwich, Hildegard of Bingen, some of these contemplative authors that I'd never heard of. And I had never really come across such a depth of teaching when it came to the prayer life. And that's really what captivated me was especially when I started reading the Desert Fathers and the Desert Mothers. The Sayings of the Desert Fathers and the Desert Mothers is a collection of kind of short anecdotal wisdom stories or wisdom quotes, maybe a few sentences that just summed up issues of the heart, issues of prayer. For instance, Evagrius of Pontus, when he talks about prayer, he says, prayer is the ascent of the mind to God. That's a great statement that really captures your thoughts and sums up the life of prayer very simply. Now, when he says mind, he doesn't necessarily mean your thought process. He means the frame of your thoughts, or the frame of who you are moving towards him, right? And so you hear these kind of statements and you go, well, that's fascinating. I want to know more about that.
Yeah, it's almost, you can see there's almost a similarity, at least from listening to that, to when in the charismatic movements today, there's this high emphasis on the presence, and you're kind of like,
yes.
well, what, when people say, we crave your presence, and what is a and it's kind of a similar, it almost feels like a state of mind or a state of being where your mind is elevated to a different, plane of thinking almost.
Yeah, for sure. There's kind of a moment where the dividing line between you and him seems to, at the very least, thin.
Yeah.
All right, and you're like, well, where's he and where am I? I don't know. We're intermingling now, which seems to me, when you look at something like 1 John, what John describes, beloved, we don't know what we're going to be, but we know that we're sons, and we know the Spirit is here, and so all the stuff he says in 1 John 3 and 4, and so there's in a certain sense, I'd find these authors in the early church, and it would go, I think I've experienced something like that. Mm-hmm. And they're explaining it in a way that makes a lot of sense to me, right? Where some of the contemporary authors I'd read, and I remember one of the books my dad handed me was Rick Joyner's "There Were Two Trees in the Garden," and The Final Quest. Right? We were good Vineyard charismatics, so you got to read Rick Joyner at that point. and those were fine, no comment on Rick Joyner and his theology or anything like that. Those were fine, but when I read the stuff that the early church fathers, specifically the Desert Fathers, were writing, I was like, I found so much vibrant life that would explain to me. Like, I knew that fasting was a thing that we're supposed to do.
Right.
Right? You're told that growing up in the church.
Yeah.
You're supposed to.
Especially at January when you're,
Exactly. New Year's resolution, all that stuff.
Yeah.
You're supposed to fast, right? but I don't think anybody ever taught me what the effect of fasting would be, or why you were supposed to fast. There was
Yeah.
just some generic answers like, "Oh, you'll hear God better," or "It'll be pleasing to God." Right? You've got the fast in Isaiah, the fast that pleases God, that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
And
Well, what kind of things did you find that were different about a real fast in their perspective?
Well, specifically, when you look at someone like John Cassian, who was a theologian and a desert father in the 4th century, he kind of the desert fathers were typically centralized in Egypt. So I get to Cassian in a second and the fasting in a second, just to explain this, that they were typically centralized in Egypt. They were quite influenced by the school of theology in Alexandria. And Cassian spent a lot of time taking the teachings of the Desert Fathers from Eastern Christianity to Western Christianity. Now, that's not how we would think of the East-West divide today, kind of, because it grew out of the East-West divide back then was Alexandria and Antioch, and in the early church, and there were two schools of thought. And so he was helping to bring some of the thoughts to the West, to Marseille. He planted churches or planted monasteries, that kind of stuff, right? So Cassian was quite a notable figure when it came to codifying the practices of the Desert Fathers and the Desert Mothers, the monastic rhythms later in the 4th century. And actually, what Cassian wrote probably had a direct influence on the Irish, St. Patrick and all this stuff.
Is this the Cassian? I remember R.C. Sproul talking about how the kind of difference between Augustinian thought and, I guess, is Cassian the one who tried to kind of reconcile this idea of almost like a more of a synergistic way of looking at things versus like a more monergistic style of Augustine, where
I'm sure he's referencing Cassian then at that point.
Because I remember it stood out to me because it seemed very close to what I believe, whereas I kind of always thought that I would consider myself Calvinist in soteriology, so I always wondered how that was reconciled with free will, and I remember kind of looking into it, and R.C. Sproul, I think, was referencing Cassian as someone who said that basically God looked at the expanse of time and sort of saw who would be cooperative and they were the elect or something along those lines. But I was wondering if it was the same Cassian. It
could be. Cassian, his two notable works were called the Institutes and the Conferences. And the conferences are a series of conversations he has with figures in Egypt, Desert Fathers in Egypt, and he's recounting in his writings the conversations he had, and they go from anywhere from theological points to the practice of a spiritual gift in a community, and so there's some really good stuff. And then the institutes are this is where you're going to get early forms of the 7 deadly sins. In the Institute, there's the 8 faults, and he goes through every single one of them, right? I have a translation of Cassian's Institutes, and for some reason, the translator, when you get to the 7 or the 8, one of the faults of lust, it says there's a disclaimer at the beginning of the chapter. This is a funny side note. Is we decided to exclude this chapter due to it's about lust, so we can't talk about
for
that.
modesty's sake.
For modesty's sake, it's like what? Anyway, so some of the stuff Cassian taught when it came to fasting is that fasting exposed your desire. It helped to clarify your thoughts. What do you crave? So when you're fasting, the first thing that happens, like you can go from not fasting to fasting and immediately you want something. And so he's talking through issues of why do you fast? Well, it's not just fasting to hear the voice of God better, be more pleasing to God, whatever, but it's because you're actually forming the inner life of the individual by helping them see the things they crave, the things they turn to for comfort, and the kind of things that they think about. And that in fasting, you come into contact with your weakness. and you actually recognize I don't have a source of sustenance. I can't provide
Yeah.
it for myself.
It's like your crutches are exposed.
Exactly, exactly. And so that made a lot of sense to me. It's like, oh,
Yeah, that's good.
that's why we're going to be fasting, is because in fasting I can find and root out some of the ways that I think that are not helpful about who I am, who God is, and how the world
Yeah.
works. And so that made sense, right? And so I'm going, oh, okay, well, maybe I'll fast more often. That would probably be helpful. And so it's that kind of instruction that I found supremely helpful in the Desert Fathers and the Desert Mothers. And then in that sense, some of the Desert Fathers and Desert Mothers you're going to get into would be, say, Basil the Great. And Basil the Great, and so I would come across these guys in the organic sense of studying. And really not studying because I was trying to go anywhere with the studying, but studying to impact myself. And I just wanted to grow and learn, and I found helpful things there. So I started reading Basil the Great, come across Basil's rules of life when it comes to the monastic order that he planted in Turkey. And then I was like, oh, he's a Cappadocian father. Oh, he defended the Trinity. Oh, like this guy's actually pretty significant. And then Basil had some really beautiful concepts that he teases out. For instance, when it comes to the progression of the spiritual life, and he talks about people that carry with them a slave-like mentality when it comes to their relation to God, and the reason they come is because there's a fear of punishment. Because a slave will be punished for not doing what they're supposed to do, right? And he says, but then there's a natural progression to a hireling type of mentality as you start to realize you're getting something out of this. And so a hireling gets paid, and they come back because of the wages that they're gaining.
Yeah.
And then he talks about the third stage is that of a son or a daughter. Yeah, well, he would say son, right? I'd add in the daughter part, but he'd say son. And that a son has in mind pleasing their father, and so the son comes to bring pleasure to the father. And he'd envision a sort of progression there, right, as you go through stages of maturity and relating to God.
Yeah, that kind of in my mind brings up or reminds me of the kind of Christian hedonism view, like the Piper Edwards kind of thing of God being most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in Him. And
Right.
That shift of our heart taking pleasure in Him is worthwhile in the end. It's not just about being a slave, like you said.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And so that I find a lot of life in that. And actually, I just in doing, I guess, going back to one of the things that we do right now is we run a podcast called Voices from the Desert. It's my friend of mine and I. We were just talking about Bernard of Clairvaux, a Western Catholic mystic in the 12th century, over against Simeon the New Theologian, an Orthodox mystic around the same time. One of the things Bernard does is he appends a fourth layer to that. And he says, so the fourth stage is that of a lover. So he does the same thing, is slave, hireling, son, and then he says lover. A lover being invested in the interests of love is the final culmination. And
I can
so
see
you
that.
can kind of see how these guys build on
Sure.
some of the earlier authors in that sense.
So then, taking or looking back at all of that then, and the kind of things that you were learning as you were encountering these early church fathers, were you struck by anything that you were like, we do things so differently or think about things so differently than they did back then? Or does anything stand out about our modern way of looking at things versus theirs?
I'm
sure there's plenty.
Where to begin? There's in terms of, because you've got in terms of thoughts and then you have in terms of practices. And so let's just starting with some of the practices. Here's one. Okay. So Anthony the Great, one of the first catalysts for the monastic movement in Christian history, right? Born 256, lives for 100 years, starts the Desert Fathers movement, and he goes into he's got a long backstory, so we won't get into everything. 18, his parents die. He gets a inheritance, gives most of the money away, goes into the desert, comes out 40 years later, and is incredibly influential. Everybody's coming to him for prayer and counsel and wisdom and all this, in a nutshell, right? So the reason Anthony retreats into the desert is because the desert is the place of warfare. This is the place where Jesus was tempted, right? Jesus went to the desert, was tempted 3 times by the devil. The book of Isaiah talks about the highway of holiness that goes through the desert paths. That's in the Septuagint. There's the jackals are in the desert. The jackals they would look at that as the demons are there. If we want to conquer ourselves, we must go fight the demons. Right. And not in the sense of spiritual warfare and intercessory screaming at the heavens, but the demons inside of me that are also around me, and the demons of lust and greed, and
metaphorical
pride.
Almost.
Metaphorical, but in the story with Anthony, they take physical shape in front of him, and he's fighting against them. But they're also manifestations of human desire, right? And so it's a both and. It's not an either or.
Okay.
And today, like I have a good friend. He was a very hardline cessationist, and had a series of engagements with the Holy Spirit, with Jesus, and all this stuff that shifted how he thought. And one of the things that happened to him was he heard the Lord speak to him and said, "There's people that have demons in your congregation, and I want you to cast them out." And he was not his realm at all. And his statement, he said right back to whatever voice was talking to him at this point, because he had no way of understanding that.
Yeah.
He said, "I thought all the demons were in Africa." Right?
Yeah, that's what we think.
Yeah, it is what we think, right? And so we tend to compartmentalize these things, right? And
Yeah,
so
that's the question I think that most young people ask, their church leaders or elders at some point. They're like, okay, well, how can we read about all these stories of demon-possessed people, but we don't see that today? Where did they all go? And I think I got answers along the lines of, well, some people are somewhere, but, not in our Western world. And obviously, I think that's pretty untrue at least from what I've heard more recently.
Yeah, and if to look at a person like Anthony, when he would talk about the demons would be close. So this would be early church spiritual formation 101. The demons would be closely associated with the passions, and the passions would be associated with the faults and the imperfections within. They're representative of our inner wounds. They're the ways we express lust, pride, greed, envy, jealousy, all these things, and there's spiritual attachments to all those things. And so what we give ourselves, we attach ourselves to. And so things like, there'll be stories about monks walking down the road, and there's a piece of gold there that's laid out by the devil to trap the monk right into greed. And so there's always a connecting point between the human desire and then the spiritual entity, right? And so if we understand that, as you can go quite deep into this, where they had this very robust, and you'll still find this in the Orthodox Church today. It's one of the things I love about the Orthodox Church, is an understanding of the human thought life that's quite profound and robust. That you have thoughts that have spiritual weight to them, and you have to learn how to deal with those things.
Yeah, like strongholds, you would say, I suppose, in more modern parlance.
Yeah, in a way. I don't know that I would call it a stronghold, simply because in a stronghold we make that the language is binary in terms of a stronghold, right? A stronghold would be a lie I believe, and now I have to think about the lie I believe and the behavior that entails, right? So a loaded thought, we'll call it. There's a particular Greek term called, and it's logismoi. The thought itself carries with it a weightiness behind it that you don't have power to resist. And so and this happens, when you understand what they're talking about. So lust happens, and lust isn't a stronghold in the sense of a lie that you believe. I guess in a very generic sense it is. But in the practical sense, when you're sitting there struggling with lust, you're not going, well, this is a stronghold. Let me identify the stronghold and figure out the stronghold. You're really assailed with it for I think the statistics now say that it's like 80%, actually 50% of pastors, I think, have some kind of pornography addiction, right?
Yeah, it's appalling.
It's crazy. And so you're confronted with this thought that you don't realize is loaded with spiritual weight, that you don't have the power to resist because your fight is not your own. So you're trying to fight something that you can't win because the fight is God's fight. The fight's not your fight. Your fight is to turn yourself to him. Your fight's not to fight against the thought. And so they had this robust teaching that talked about, well, how do you turn yourself from that, the thing you have no power over, to this, which has all the power? And that's that. So the difference between talking about a stronghold is a stronghold, in the way that I've heard it taught anyway, is a system of thought that you have to identify. And when you can identify that system of thought, then you can carry that system of thought and go, well, that's not the way I think anymore.
Something you've kind of accepted.
Something you've accepted. Yeah. And that's a thing. I'm not saying it's not a thing. There's obviously strongholds of the mind. Paul talks about this, right? But what they're talking about is the actual granular experience of being tempted by a thought. How do you respond to that? And that's really helpful instruction, right? Like, okay.
Something I found really interesting and really helpful actually is, I think this was from Pints with Aquinas. I cannot remember who said it, but someone had said that when thinking of something like lust as an example, I don't know if this is a uniquely Catholic way of looking at things, or traditional, for want of a better term, based on that sort of long tradition of church fathers. This person was saying that instead of just sort of sitting there and suffering and being like, oh, I'm so tempted, I feel terrible, how am I going to resist? He said at that point, that's when you should turn to God and say, I'm not just asking for grace for me, but I also want you to give grace to 10 other people struggling with the same thing at this particular time. And it's almost like turning to the offensive in that moment, because you realize you're in the midst of a battle. Yeah. And perhaps there's something there where that is drawn from a tradition, like you said, where there is more of a recognition of the spiritual weight that's attached to your thought life and your temptations and that kind of thing.
Yeah, so there's just to illustrate that, there's a story in the Desert Mothers of a woman, I think it's Amma Sarah. They would refer to them as Abbas and Ammas, mothers and fathers. That's the term of endearment, and honor and respect, that kind of stuff. So Amma Sarah had it says that she had a struggle with a demon of lust for 13 years. Mm-hmm. And she never rebuked the spirit. She said, not I that fight, but Christ that lives in me. Right. And after 13 years, the demon manifests physically, because the manifestation of the struggle is that she's tempted. Right. Right. And so the demon manifests physically in front of her, as the story goes, and saying, Sarah, you've conquered me, which is another ploy by the demons to get her to succumb to pride. And she says, I haven't conquered you, but Christ has vanquished you, because he's vanquished me. Right. And so that's kind of the idea there, is we're not the ones doing the fighting, right? As far as you're well, as far as you're concerned, you're dead. Like, you don't live anymore. Yeah. So how can you fight? He lives in you. And this is where Paul, I think you could probably recharacterize in a helpful way to the 21st century person, when Paul says, not I that live, but Christ that lives in me. I think it's probably really helpful for people to hear it in a way that says, it's not I that live, but love lives its way through me. Right? Thinking of it somewhere, because it's kind of this, it turns into this like, well, I got to picture Jesus in my heart and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, well, actually, you're no longer alive in there, but love is living in you and living its way through you. And so how do I live a life that fosters that? And that kind of, in my experience, that kind of teaching just was absent from my upbringing. And in the discipleship models and all that kind of stuff. I like to kind of, maybe it's a little bit too mean to point this out.
Go for it.
But I like to say that the great transformation model of the evangelical church is attend church, read your Bible, and stack chairs. And if you do these three things,
you'll find a wife for sure.
Yeah, you'll find a wife for sure. Yeah, that's right.
Only if you stack 10 on each arm.
You got to stack 10 on each arm, right? As long as you attend church and you read your Bible and you stack chairs, that's kind of what our models of discipleship and Christian formation have amounted to for the last.
I suppose that diminishes this kind of intimate transformation, like you said, of. I guess I would consider that the process of sanctification, or that's what I would, the way I would just describe it off the top of my head. This, it's not just like I always say to people, I don't have this works-based theology where we need to just do certain things to be better. But I do say to people, if you're not a little better by the time you're 70 versus when you're 20,
Yeah.
then I would question, the depth of relationship you have there, because the Holy Spirit
Yeah.
should be sanctifying us and should be producing more fruit through the course
Right.
of our lives. And maybe that is something that we're missing, where through a vibrant, I suppose, prayer life, and this idea of contemplative prayer and things like that is interesting to me, because I don't think we make room for that in modern society very much.
Sure.
Is that something you would agree
I
with?
would, yeah, I would agree. So, like I was saying with Anthony going into the desert to go into the place of battle, right? Well, today we try and retreat from society to get away from the battle. We want peace and quiet, right? And so there's just this way of approaching things that is, when it comes to the differences between how we practice today and what we practiced back then. You hear a lot of, well, you need to go on a spiritual retreat and quiet yourself to hear God and all that kind of stuff. And to the big differences to the early fathers, the retreat was to go into battle, but the battle was over your soul. The battle wasn't over a region or a principality or something like that, right?
Yeah, very much more individualistic, or
Yeah, for sure. And when you're talking about having a works-based salvation, I mean, obviously our Luther's concepts have entered into our common vernacular now, right? We have this kind of idea, but it's really not fair to Luther and to the Catholic Church of that particular age, because remember, Luther's arguing against something very specific, right? When he nails the 95 Theses, he's arguing against. And when you study church history, the Catholic Church was a mess at that point.
Yeah.
And all the hand wringing the Catholics can do about that it's the office of the Pope that's important. It's the office of the priest, not the person that occupies it. Well, the person that occupies it's pretty important too. So that's
well, it sort of leads to interesting questions. Where I mentioned beforehand, I was curious personally of when we look at that era. There was obviously a build up to Luther and the Reformation, and
for sure,
people saw, I'm sure even Luther himself, compared to what modern Protestants are like, his beliefs even were very different to where we've ended up today. There's been a process of I suppose moving away from tradition in a lot of senses, and kind of it almost feels like we've kind of torn everything down to the basics and are building it back up in a fresh tradition. You mentioned even there's a charismatic tradition in certain senses, or there's Methodist traditions or Presbyterian traditions that are coming from that. But looking back at that time in the Reformation, at what point did the church fathers start to move into territory, or even people in the history of the church? When do you think they really diverged from sound biblical teaching? Because when I'm looking more into those church fathers, I think of Catholics recommend Aquinas as someone really useful to read, and then there's things that I'm sure you're aware of a lot of things that even Aquinas or others believe that for Protestants would be problematic. So at what point do we kind of move from safe theology in the tradition to read with a bit more discernment and care?
Yeah, and that's it's a great question, and it's probably a question you could spend the next lifetime really thinking through. And one of the things, you say, what can we identify what's safe, right? In terms of safe theology, in terms of things to read. Well, for one, I'll say ideas are never safe. They're the most potent thing that you can ever possibly come across. So I'm not so much when I talk with people that want to explore the teachings of early church fathers, or as you get into even Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas has some amazing stuff on spiritual gifts for sure, and I'm quite passionate about helping people hear the voice of God, and Aquinas has some really good stuff in that. Funny enough, and so I don't so much want to point people to the safest person to read, because then everybody will be stuck with, you can't even read the Bible at that point then. Right? What I want to do is help strengthen people so that they can make sound judgments, which I think is one of the things Luther was about. Was
exercising discernment
and going, well, this idea might be a good idea, but this idea might not be a good idea. And, because you could equally, using Luther as the public beating horse right now, you could criticize pretty soundly at this point in Western civilization the idea of salvation by faith alone, not works based, because what it's done is it's disassociated the process of transformation from the communal gathering, and that's one of the big differences between the Protestant church and we'll say the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church or the Anglican Church for that matter.
Yeah, you get into sacraments and that kind of thing, the sacramental view of theology.
And so I can be saved because I said a private prayer and I could just hang out in my house for the next 50 years. And that would be like, Luther would never agree with that. Right. And that wasn't his point, but it's become, that in some sense, that's kind of what it's become. Right.
Yeah.
It's a lot more complicated than that. And so you can say, well, that's an idea that when you get into, I think it's an 18th century author named William Law. He was an Episcopalian priest. And William Law is like, he's tearing Luther apart left, right, and center, saying you're creating false disciples because what you're telling people is they can be saved without actually doing the work of the kingdom. And that wasn't what Luther had in mind. What Luther had in mind was indulgences, was the corruption in the leadership, and all of this. And in the 15th century, about 50 years before Luther's 95 Theses, the Pope of the day, Asterius Urbanus, the fourth, I think, is who it was. He commissions a inquiry into the state of the church, and you can find the letters that he wrote, because he said, like, we've lost all of our influence in the culture and we don't know why. And so he commissions this inquiry. They come back and they say, essentially, you conduct yourself with so much pomp and you've gotten so far away from what built the church was the blood of the martyrs, people that were willing to die for their teaching. They paired the lifestyle with the teaching, and you can't get back to that. And Asterius Urbanus lays out a number of steps that he thinks the Catholic Church should go through for reformation. Well, they never happened, right? So eventually you produce Luther because the Catholic Church couldn't reform itself. And so, you get to, okay, who's safe to read? Well, none of them are safe to read. But if you're strengthened, you're in a strong supportive community. I know not everybody is. You've got some good kind of mothers and fathers of the faith pouring into you, right? And you've
people
got
to kind of
sound.
chew it over with.
Exactly. Then I'd say, hey, have at it and go read some of these guys and see what they have to say, because you're going to discover some ideas that will shape how you think. But you're also going to read some and you're going to be like, well, that sounds wrong. Well, now you can actually go through, why does that sound wrong?
Yeah, maybe it's just this lens I'm looking at as to, if I was, speaking to maybe a teenager or something, like, maybe I'm probably thinking of it from the perspective of, who can I recommend with a clear conscience, kind of a thing, because I'm sure someone in our position that's maybe have more experience studying a little bit of theology, they might be able to read Pelagius and glean something from it that was interesting and of note, and be able to discard the heresy, that was condemned there, or be able to go, maybe they would be able to read others from the Reformation and not just dive into pure antinomianism, it's like there's always a cutting edge to where, like, you get something fresh and new and interesting, but it could lead to something else unhealthy if you obsess on that particular point.
And so I will give you some good recommendations in a second. And what I'd say to that is I totally agree with you. And giving someone we'll put it this way. So we're talking about the 17-year-old that's going, I want to learn about theology and I don't want to, what should I learn? Right. What should I read? And the thing is, if I'm not willing to walk with them and help share the thoughts and let them express how they think, and then help them form how they think and ask them questions and actually give them insight or point them in the right direction, then they're going to come across stuff anyway, and it doesn't matter what they read. They're going to form some thoughts based on their family of origin, the culture they grow up in, and all the assumptions they have being a 21st century Western citizen and a Christian. And so I've got to commit to walking with them anyway. In that sense, right? So, because people gain warped ideas left, right, and center just from their upbringing, and what happens when they read someone, and the person they read actually lends itself, like for instance, one of the things that I think we're contending with in prophetic ministry. I would be an advocate for God speaking and prophecy being alive and well today. Not everybody has to be, but that's fine, right? And there's a large segment of prophetic ministry that would teach that there are prophecies that are foretelling, and there's prophecies that are forthtelling. And so the prophecies that are foretelling are prophecies that, and I just came across this the other day. Like, so I know about this. It's been around for a long time. I've been involved in prophetic. Like I know Bethel's teachings. I've got, John Paul Jackson. I've been around for long enough to know a lot of the stuff that goes around in that sense. And so foretelling is predicting the future.
Sure.
Forthtelling is creating the future. And so
okay.
the idea is
Like speaking it out.
You're speaking it out. Yeah, it's the name it, claim it thing, right?
Sure. Yeah, and it's interesting because that's what I hear even worship leaders saying. I'm just going to prophesy this over the land.
Exactly.
Right now.
And so it's a thought that's entered into the common expression. And the idea that usually the undergirding idea is Ezekiel prophesying to the valley of dry bones, and the bones and the sinews spring forth, and all of that. So look how powerful our words are.
Yeah. The blessed is he who says things not as they are, but as they should be. I can't remember the exact verse, but there's a verse there that's, I think it's New Testament, where it says about, saying, maybe it's not. I can't remember where it is, but there is something about, saying things.
When you can't remember, you just say it's in the Bible somewhere.
It's somewhere in the Bible. I don't think it was Bill Johnson. I think it originated in the Bible.
Yeah.
Or I don't think it was from Kenneth Copeland or Joyce Meyer, but I don't know. But
well, you take these ideas, you stretch them to their limit, right, and you eventually break the principle, as if God wasn't the one causing the sinews to form, and it was a vision that it's not like they formed in front of him. It's a vision he had, and it was about the resurrection of the kingdom of God on the face of the earth, and it's about the church age. Like this isn't about Ezekiel creating the future by his words. It's about Ezekiel recognizing something that's happening, and he's given a special part to play in it. So as soon as you try and break that and extrapolate it, now you've got this concept of forthtelling, which enters into the vernacular of charismatic Christianity especially. And so what happens is, now someone who struggles with pride, if they're not conscientious of the pride, they go, well, I can forthtell the future because my words create the reality. And so come learn from me and I'll teach you how to do the same thing. So I'm now rich because I prophesied that I was going to be rich. So now keep giving me your $500, $1,000 conference attendance fee, So it becomes so warped because the idea, pay attention to the words you say, is a good idea. And your words have the power of life and death, which is a good idea. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So speak words of life over people. And when you take the idea and stretch it to its breaking point, you get broken people that manipulate the idea. And so now I've got to work and contend with the way people have been formed, the way they think, and how they've been hurt, how they've been traumatized, the kind of wounds they carry from their childhood into adulthood. And this is where the teachings of the Desert Fathers I found insanely helpful, when the passions and the thoughts and all these things, your inner wounds that dictate and control you and give you structure for how to respond. So all of that to say, before I answer, how does someone not get into trouble? It's like someone doesn't get into trouble because they read the wrong book. It's because they come across the ideas and they don't have anybody to walk them through.
They're on their own. Sure.
And
that's something I'm definitely passionate about in terms of, I look at it maybe more from the lens of men spending time particularly with other men, because, there's obviously issues that guys struggle with, the girls don't, but it doesn't necessarily have to be like that. It can be just having that group of people that you're able to discuss things with. And me and some friends, we always joke about, we have our own high council where we discuss things and make a resolution basically on things that we've looked at and discussed. So for example, one of us might watch a Brian Zahnd debate or something where he's talking about atonement theology or something like that, and we will discuss that and then sort of come to this understanding of, do we think that's right, do we think it's wrong? And that's where maybe that's something that is certainly lacking, at least in my perspective, from my opinion, in the modern church, is that the early church did have these great discussions and councils and debates. And the Catholics and Orthodox would probably say, well, you all stopped, we didn't, but
that's it. They would. And one of the things you find in the desert tradition then also is you've got a lot of communities gathered around a particular father who has 7 or 8 young men walking with him, and he's helping to form and cultivate how they think and what they practice. So you saw it baked within the system in a certain sense, right? And a lot of the theology of the early church into the Aquinas and even Luther actually, on that sense, started in the monastic tradition. The monasteries were really the central place for theology. So with all that said, some of my favorite authors that I have found very encouraging would be Basil the Great. I love Basil the Great, and Basil of Caesarea. Basil, you could say Basil. Yeah, that works as well. Yeah, and Basil, not Basil Faulty. We won't not
Yeah,
getting
sure.
him right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we're getting into, Augustine, or sorry, yeah, Augustine and Augustine.
Augustine.
Same
I
thing.
always grew up with Augustine, but
So did I. Well, I'm living in Florida right now. It's St. Augustine, the place. So I just tend
Oh
to say
yeah,
Augustine.
that's right. Yeah, that's right. So I love Basil. Now Basil's one when he writes the long and the short rules of monastic life, which can be informative in terms of structure for life, and certain people in the spiritual formation crowd are talking about developing your own rule of life. I know Pete Scazzaro talks about this, and John Mark Comer talk about this.
Sure.
And so Basil, it's not really the same thing, but they're kind of inspired by that idea. But some of it is pretty onerous that you're probably not going to recommend that a 21st century Western civilian does that.
Yeah. I was going to say, do you find it relevant?
So yeah, what's not relevant though are things like the practice of sleeplessness. So sometimes they think, well, sleep is a human function. We want to overcome human function, and so we need to stop sleeping.
Yeah, sleep fast.
Yeah, there's stuff like that, and I'm like, well, that's the kind of thing that I'm like, I can take everything with a grain of salt, and I don't have to buy every single concept. What I find is when we get into the conversation around Jesus and what constitutes the person of Jesus, especially when you read some of the, like Basil, like Athanasius, like Augustine, and Leo the Great, Cyril of Alexandria, and you read what these guys had to say about the person of Jesus, and then Irenaeus, to go even further back, right? Irenaeus of Lyon in the 2nd century, you're finding some fascinating teaching about who Jesus is, how we'd understand him, and then the impact that has upon us. Irenaeus codified.
He was descended from John, like as in the line of discipleship.
Yeah,
from John
so Irenaeus would have been a disciple of John. I think it was Polycarp to Irenaeus, if I remember right. But there would have been crossover with John and Irenaeus. I think he was one disciple removed.
A couple of degrees, Hippolytus or whatever was in there. How do you say that?
Yeah, and I think he was just after Irenaeus, Hippolytus.
I don't know how you say that.
Just pretend like you know.
Yeah, Hippolytus, Hippolytus.
Like I said Basil so confidently, and now I know it's Basil.
Yeah, you got to just go for it.
Yeah. Actually, fun fact about the Josh on this side of the call is we named our 3rd child Cassian.
Wow.
And I couldn't believe my wife actually agreed to it, for one.
Yeah? As in the first name?
Yeah, first name. Yeah, his first name is Cassian, named after John Cassian. But then, they had to go make that Star Wars movie where one of the characters, his name is Cassian.
Yeah,
and it's
that's right.
No, it's not that one.
Yeah.
But then I also found out that probably the technical ancient pronunciation of the word would be Cassian. And so but anyway, so we're always learning.
Yeah, we have no idea, and I just there's so many names like that where I'm like, you kind of have an inkling of Greek pronunciations, or and you're like, I'm just gonna go for it.
Just go for it. Pretend like you know.
I was a history teacher last year at a Christian high school. My wife and I both worked there.
Okay,
well, I suppose it's a school for all ages, but we taught in high school. But,
right.
Teaching history and going through the book, there are times where you do just have to go, okay, I'm just going to go for it. And,
yeah, that's right.
And they asked me, is that the right way of saying it? And I'm like, I don't know, but we're going to stick with it.
We're going to stick with it. Exactly. So going back to an earlier thought where we were talking about Irenaeus, Irenaeus in his book Against Heresies, which is really long, like you can get a abridged version, it'd probably be helpful, because Irenaeus is going through some of the, it's called Against Heresies. He's going against, a lot of the Gnostic heresies. He lays them out and talks about where they fall apart and how they're not scriptural. And so most of the best authors are trying to weigh all their ideas against Scripture, and you find a lot of that, especially in the Apostolic Fathers, which is the group of guys who directly descend from the apostles. And so you have Barnabas, you have Clement of Rome, you have Ignatius of Antioch. These guys, when they write letters, because we have the corpus of letters from a lot of these guys that were descended from the apostles directly, mostly what they're doing is affirming Scripture. Lots of it is just quotes from what Paul wrote, from what James wrote, what John wrote, this kind of stuff. And they're quoting and quoting and quoting and quoting, and then talking about applying those things in the practice of community. So a lot less theological teaching until Irenaeus is probably kind of the first guy who lays out a systematic thought process about the nature of Jesus, his relation to God. And one of the things he says is he codifies an early church theological position, which I think is absolutely true. And it's something like this. The formula is something like this. God became man so that man could become God. And not God in the direct sense, but little g God, and not little g God in the Benny Hinn sense. Little g God in the sense that we've become partakers of the divine nature, and his image is being made clear through us.
What's the word for that? Theosis?
Theosis is the term the Orthodox would use. Divinization would be the Catholics would use that term. And it's essentially it's a bit of what we mean when we say sanctification. They would argue with us and say, no, it's not. And we'd say, well, it kind of is. And it's not exactly the same, but it is this process of becoming like. Because sanctification would be the progression of holiness in the life of the believer. Theosis would probably be characterized more as the progression of healing and integration into the life of God. Because in Orthodox theology, when it comes to spiritual formation, you become a humble person not because you practice humility, but because you participate in the life of God, and his life is pure humility.
Okay.
So
is that referring to really the concept of our communion with the Holy Spirit, and that just that state of being in unity, or
in a way it is. It's then you're talking about the early church fathers would have differentiated between the energies of God and the essence of God. So or I think the Catholic guys call it emanations from God. I think there's different terms that they would use, right? And so when you're participating, you are there's a direct experience meted upon the human being through the agency of the Holy Spirit, which proceeds in the creedal language, proceeds from the Father and the Son, depending on whether you're looking at East or West.
That's a whole other debate right there.
Right. And
how do you pronounce that? That's filioque.
The filioque,
Filioque. At least I got that one right.
Yes.
That pronunciation.
Yes, he did good. And so Irenaeus is really talking about that becoming journey. So, for instance, probably one of the ways to understand that would be summed up in the reputation of Macarius the Great, who was a desert father, a direct disciple of Anthony the Great. So we're talking, Macarius was alive from 300 to 391. By the way, I know a lot of this because I wrote about it in my collection, the Silent Fire collection. I can send you a link if you want to share it with the episode, but a link.
Absolutely.
You can find this on Amazon. It's a series of devotional entries based on the lives of the Desert Fathers and the Desert Mothers. So Macarius
we'll be sure to plug that.
Yeah.
Maybe we could even run a giveaway sometime,
that'd be great. I'd be happy to do that for sure.
It'd be cool to get that into the hands of one of our followers, and maybe we'll post some details about that in the future.
Yeah, that would be great. I'd be happy to do that.
Yeah.
So Macarius, the reputation of Macarius it says Macarius became a god on earth. And so, our 21st century sensibilities, we read that first sentence, we go, wait a second.
Yep.
Yikes, right? Where's this going? But that's because we've been so inundated with people who have claimed that.
Who really do think that.
Or in their
practice.
Mormons mentioned, and even some of the more excessive charismatic, or the more some of the excesses in the charismatic movement have kind of gone there, or so going back to what, like William Branham and some of these guys who really went off their rocker, thinking they're the incarnation of Elijah and all this stuff, right? We look at it from that perspective. But so Macarius became a god on earth because he covered the faults of others as if he didn't see them. Okay. Now, look, I'm okay with the second part now, right?
Sure.
And so
Yeah.
what they mean when someone like Irenaeus says God became man so that man might become God, really what he's riffing on is 2 Corinthians 7 that says he became poor for our sake that we might become rich in him, right? So this is what he's saying is we become like him, and we are the way in a direct sense that his presence is mediated out to the world because we are the image bearers living their life in God's good creation, being like him. So Macarius is known as a God, quote unquote God on earth, because when people looked at him, he looked like God, right? He was looking at people. There's lots of stories of Macarius seeing people in deep sin, refusing to judge them because he goes, who am I to judge them? I've been guilty of things in my own life too.
Yeah.
And so he practices this willingness to forgive.
Yeah. This deep compassion.
And so he looks like God on earth because he carries the qualities of what Jesus looked like on earth. And so when you're looking at I've taught through some of Irenaeus's theological points on that, and people always are like, well, but you can't say that. And it's like, well, let's hear what they're trying to say, because what they're saying is that in your actions and in who you are and how you know God and how you've been formed by him, your life becomes radically different. And because your life becomes radically different, you become a witness to who he is through the tenderness in your heart, the love and the tender mercy, the forgiveness, the humility, and all this stuff. And it's like one of the really influential monastic figures was a guy named Pachomios. And I had to search through the file for that name for a second.
Yeah.
That's not a name that I could convince my wife to name any of our children.
Yeah,
right?
maybe the next one. Yeah.
So Pachomios was the guy who took what Anthony started and systematized it. So they said by the time Pachomios passed away, there were 7,000 monastics in the desert now. And he had kind of codified the practices in a very direct sense for them. And then Cassian's the guy who took it to the next stage. So Pachomios became a Christian. He was raised in a pagan family, and he is enlisted in the Roman army, and he's sent off to war. And I don't remember what war it is, but some particular war. And the conditions of the city that they were occupying were quite horrible for the Roman troops. And so the Roman soldiers are, they're starving, all this kind of stuff. Well, the Christians in the city go to the Roman occupying army, right, that are occupying their city, and take care of them. They feed the Roman troops, and they bathe them, they clothe them, they take care of them. And he's so struck by the kindness of the Christians, he resolves at that point that when he leaves the service of the army, he's going to go to the very first church he can find and dedicate his life to Jesus. And so that's what it means when it says we become like God on earth, because when you look at what the Christians like, it looks like what the Father's like. Sure, so that's what Irenaeus is saying. Is that
that's what we're commanded to be.
Exactly. And so his point is that we become that not because we put so much effort into doing that, but because we participate in the life of God. And when his life is in us, and part of their participation in the early church is definitely going to be the sacraments. I mean, that is, and in a direct sense, we don't have to go all there now, but sacrament versus symbol. But in a direct sense, the sacraments do form the life of God within a person to them, but also that life of prayerfully, maybe contemporary language, we prayerfully abiding in the presence of Jesus, right? Prayerful rhythms. The Desert Fathers identified probably somewhere between 6 to 8 or 9 practices of the spiritual life: remembrance of God, fasting, prayer, silence, solitude. The remembrance of death was another one, and so there's these practices that created space for God to move within the inner man and form his being within the inner man, and so that's kind of what they mean when they're talking about it. Not so much God, not in an elevated positional sense, but in an image-bearing sense. You look like him.
Yeah, and perhaps this would be a good sort of final topic. If we look back at the church fathers and the people who from the tradition through the years, do you think there's anything today that we perhaps take for granted as just established Christian orthodoxy, that something that was really struggled with and fought for a long time that really wasn't that had to be debated and discussed, because I feel like today we're sitting on an abundance of like strife and almost debate, discussion, and warfare between these people who had to hash out these issues in order to find
Right.
what they believe to be the truth. So is there something that you would look back and think, okay, well, this is something that was not established for a long time, but right now we take it for granted?
Yeah, for sure. I'm glad you asked that question, because today the argument, it tends to be over practices and ancillary details that can be important. The what kind of embodiment does Christianity take in a nationalistic sense, right? Like that's a big a big debate today, right? But that's not a theological debate in the sense of we're trying to figure out what Jesus is like.
Right.
And I think it reflects what we think Jesus is like, but it's not a debate that's telling us this is what Jesus is like, right? What's the impact of Christian nationalism in America and certain countries, in Canada for that matter, and the impact on politics and all of that, right? Like that. So those are the kind of debates we're having
that's a topic,
on a bigger stage, right?
I'm really looking to get into that topic. Hopefully, at some point in the future.
It's a fascinating one. So when you have someone on, let me know, because I want to listen to that one.
Yeah, absolutely.
But so those are the conversations we're having. And so, in a sense, we're very privileged because we've been handed a way of thinking theologically on a silver platter that is where we have language that really derives from the creedal statements, where we would say, kind of and I alluded to this earlier, where Jesus is both fully God and fully man, right? God is 3 in 1, right? These kind of easy statements to say.
Yeah, just say it glibly without any
thought, right?
Yeah.
There's no thought behind it, right? And so that's why I go, like, the pastors I had growing up, they don't so much think they failed me in the sense of they didn't teach me about these things, but we just so casually were handed this great tradition with rich heritage and rich understanding, and we have, as a church in this age, failed to mind the depths of it. Especially the evangelical church have failed to mind the depths of it, and we're stuck debating sort of things out here rather than the kind of really important things that we should be talking about. And so, in particular, in answer to the question, I have found in reading, and that's actually really started with some of the episodes on the Remnant Radio that Matt Esquivel did before the 12-part series, where you kind of came across what I was doing on the Remnant Radio, where we talked through patristic theology. I had seen some of the things Matt had done a few years ago and was like, that's fascinating. He was talking about the hypostatic union, and I was like, I've not heard anybody talk about the nature of Jesus that way. I want to know more. So I messaged Matt. Actually, I'd never met him before. I messaged Matt on Facebook, and I said, hey, can you point me to some books? I'm trying to explore this, because I think what you're saying has vast ramifications for how we think about spiritual formation, how we think about inner healing, how we think about discipleship, how we think about the preaching, teaching method within evangelical Christianity. Side note, one of the things that people can think through when you try and figure out what's important in your Christian tradition, just look at what takes center stage in your church building. Because in a liturgical church, like a Catholic, Orthodox, or Anglican one, what's going to take center stage is the altar. And a lot of times the preaching pulpit's going to be off to the side, because Jesus takes center stage.
Jesus is there, yeah.
He's there, to them, he's there in the elements.
Yeah,
we might not
the
think
Mass is the point. That's the
Mass is
primary
the point. And there's something beautiful about what they claim is the most important thing. So anyway, that's a side note. But it is reflective of the hypostatic union, because the hypostatic union to them happens every single Sunday, right? In the bread, and to varying degrees, right? The Orthodox are a lot more comfortable with the mystery of communion. The Catholics try and explain all the finer details, and I think they kind of lose the forest for the trees in that sense.
Yeah. Would you give a very quick sort of definition of that hypostatic union? Because I feel like I know it, but I want to make sure I'm thinking of the right thing.
Yeah. That's right. Thank you for slowing me down, Josh.
I just want to make sure.
So the hypostatic union derives itself from the term hypostasis. Hypostasis is the word in the Greek for nature. And so the hypostatic union is hypostasis is nature. Yeah. And so when you find it, the word exists throughout the New Testament, right? It's there. So in the early church, when you got into the 5th century, you were finding a argument that was maturing over time on the nature of Jesus. And okay, we can say now at this point in the development, we can say now and affirm now with good language. It's clarified by creeds and council decisions, which, by the way, weren't formulating new thoughts; they were codifying apostolic thoughts.
Yeah.
And so the reason why the creeds arose and the arguments arose is because people were teaching things outside of. So Arianism arises, and everybody goes, "Wait a second, that doesn't sound right." Right? So it wasn't that they were going, well, the development of Christology resulted in the Nicene Creed. No, the development of Arianism resulted in the Nicene Creed because we needed to codify what actual biblical language was going to be for talking about the nature of Jesus, right?
Shout out to St. Nicholas.
There you go. That's right. The punching Santa. Yes.
That was, I don't know if you've seen that clip. I interviewed someone about Christmas, and that was one of the funny stories that.
It's
that
Father
came out.
Ron. When you have him on, he was
Yeah.
he took the our episode we did on the Nicene Council. Father Ron did the teaching on and kind of led that one, and we called it the punching episode or something like that. It was it's a funny one. So anybody that doesn't know what we're talking about, go look at Josh's old episode on Christmas. I know I saw that on the list of episodes you have there. So we find the creeds codified what had already come over against what was arising at the day, right? So Arianism was saying Jesus was a created being. We can call him God, but he's a created being. He's not the same as God the Father. And so the Nicene Creed, they come out and they go, no, let's reason through what the scriptures say. And Augustine, influential for the Nicene Creed, goes, the only reason why you're confused is because you're not consulting the full breadth of Scripture. I love Augustine, actually, when he writes this book on the Trinity. He starts it off by saying, better people have written about this than I have. And it's like, this is Augustine.
I should start that disclaimer. Better podcasts are out there. I promise you. If you're listening to me, you're wasting your time.
That's right. So when we get to the 5th century, when the hypostatic union is the formula for how we talk about this is coming about, it's because people were going, okay, well, we can talk about Jesus being fully human, but that just means that he had a body. Like, it's just like he was God with flesh on, right? And so we're not saying that he's not fully human. We're not saying he's not human. But what happens in that kind of conceptualization is God is kind of more God than he is human. And we have that problem today, actually. Maybe this isn't a fair reading of some of the Reformed circles, but it seems to me that Jesus, the humanity of Jesus, tends to be more emphasized than the divinity of Jesus. And so he's the perfect sacrifice, but we don't necessarily think of him as the perfect representation of the Father. And so in kind of a common parlance, right? And I'm not saying Calvin would have said that. I'm saying some of the ways we have the ideas handed to us on a silver platter. And so, well, he's the perfect sacrifice. He was sinless. And the charismatic church does the same thing where, well, Jesus was a man who was filled with the Spirit, and he showed us what it was like to be a man filled with the Spirit. Well, now you've de-emphasized the divinity and you've emphasized the humanity. And I find that we still find ourselves in some of those troubling waters that are a bit more nuanced than just outright modalism, like you would find in some of the the cults like Mormonism and the Jehovah's Witness and stuff.
You just get into the weeds thinking about even just this idea of again, getting my references messed up, but where it talks about he didn't count equality with God as something to be grasped in terms of like
Philippians 2.
Did he set aside his divine nature for that moment? For his time on earth, or did he like, was he choosing not to operate in that? Or
so this is the issue of the hypostatic union right there, and every one of the early church fathers who wasn't a heretic anyway would firmly deny that Jesus set aside his divinity in order to become human for a particular period of time, and there's no way he can be anything less than God. And so they would say, and probably the ESV translates that a little bit better, where it says he made himself of no reputation, right? The King James or the New King James is what says he emptied himself and took on the form of a servant. And so they would say something like this, that him taking on the form of a servant in no way diminished his divine qualities. Rather, they elevated the human qualities. And so Jesus, in taking on the form of a servant, actually shows what it means to be truly human. It means to be human united with God. And which is, and then we can get into a whole, like the language from Genesis 1 when God says, let's make man in our image. The language in that passage is the language of making a project. That's in the Hebrew and in the Greek. Let's start a project. And the project is going to be man in our own image. And this is early patristic theology. Man in our image, the culmination of that project is Jesus on the cross saying it is finished. This is now the perfect picture of humanity, is Jesus on the cross. That's kind of the idea there, right?
I bet they've got some interesting things to say about total depravity and Imago Dei and that kind of stuff.
I mean, you'll definitely find those things in there. They're just that what took center precedence was the nature. What's Jesus like? And those kind of things might have been, so when it comes to the creeds, right? And now we would get into the Council of Chalcedon, the Chalcedonian Creed, which is where the hypostatic union is codified. So I still haven't given you a definition of that. I'm getting there. Yeah. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to those things, right? So the creeds give you the language to talk about certain things that are vitally important to Christianity. You don't have a creed in the early church defining total depravity, right? Not like Calvin did when he puts out Tulip, right? Or what became Tulip anyway. And so it would be an ancillary issue that different people would disagree on, and it would not be the de facto way you would have to think, because they're trying to figure out what's Jesus like and how do we talk about that? How do we accurately communicate that? So hypostatic union, the word hypostasis meaning natures. The argument started because Nestorius was preaching about the nature of Mary, not the nature of Mary, but the name Mary. People tended to share the popular name to call Mary was the Theotokos, and the Orthodox would still say this, right? That which means the bearer of God, the God bearer, right?
And Catholics to an extent, I think,
would still say, they would say that for sure. They'd have no problem with that. And I don't think we evangelicals have any problem with saying Mary's the mother of God. And that is because of the Nestorius Cyril argument.
Sure, it depends what you mean by God in that sentence.
So Nestorius said we shouldn't call her the Theotokos, rather the Christokos, the bearer of Christ. And so in saying that, he ticked off a whole lot of people, because affirming that Mary is the bearer of God isn't so much saying something about Mary as it is saying something about the baby in the womb. This is fully God, fully man. Jesus, from the get-go, was both God and man. If we're going to say that he was only the Christokos, that he was only the Messiah, essentially the Messiah man, then we've robbed him of his divinity. And this was Cyril's argument with Nestorius. Now, Cyril was a better diplomat than Nestorius. Nestorius really ticked everybody off. Cyril was really good at buying people gifts. That's really why he won the argument. He was right in the sense of theology, but he like the final nail in the straw was when he bought all the bishops in the city gifts, and they turned against Nestorius. So it was so the argument was over, what do we say, that does Jesus have one nature, that the divine and human have become one nature in the man Christ, and so it's one nature in God? Or do we say that he has two natures, that somehow the divine nature assumed the human nature, and now the human nature has disappeared into the divine nature, and that we have one person with one nature? Or do we say we have one person with two natures? And so if we say we have one person with one nature, then and we're affirming that he's God, and the humanity part has kind of either disappeared, been subsumed into him, or been overwhelmed, then what is there to redeem? Because he's no longer fully man. So for him, Gregory Nazianzus, he would say it this way, leading into the hypostatic union: what he has not assumed, he has not healed, but what he has assumed has been saved. And so anything that he took on to himself, human mind, human will, human emotions, human heart. He took on everything it meant to be human in order to redeem everything it meant to be human.
Right. And if he hadn't assumed that, then it wouldn't be.
Then it wouldn't be
wouldn't be
saved,
redeemed.
it wouldn't be
Okay.
healed, right?
Yeah.
So the issue of salvation in the early church oftentimes was communicated as an issue of healing, the healing of humanity. And it's less a judicial alleviation of guilt and more a healing of the stain of sin upon the sickness of sin upon humanity, upon the human person.
Yeah. To touch briefly on your last point about the
Theotokos, Christokos debate there, yeah.
Yeah. So again, with pronunciations, my
Yeah.
gosh, I'm struggling. So to touch back on that, I just have a sneaking suspicion that the church fathers, when they were putting together this idea, that they weren't meaning that Mary is Yahweh's eternal mother.
That's not really what they would have meant at that point.
That seems to be the way that it sort of seems to be, because they do seem to differentiate Catholics today with, there's definitely a mother of Christ aspect to where she is the intercessor, or she intercedes to the intercessor.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So there is something to where it does seem to be Christ specific.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's that there is a divinity aspect. So it's curious, because I'm sure what we have ended up with today in the modern Catholic Church isn't really what was envisioned back then.
No, for sure it wasn't. Like again, the idea was about in Constantinople, where Nestorius was, he ticked people off because the adoration of Mary was very popular there. They had songs and statues and all this stuff. I learned this from Matt Esquivel, actually. He talked about this. They really venerated, in that sense, making the distinction between veneration and worship. They really venerated Mary, and so anything that would seem to denigrate her really ticked off the populace. Now, Cyril's problem wasn't so much that people were angry. Cyril's problem was that it was just wrong to say the Theotokos was that the God-man was not in her womb, but the Christ-man was. Because he was going, we have to preserve that he was everything human, and he never became less than that. And so that's the distinction. So the hypostatic union is two hypostases. That's the natures, the hypostasy of divinity, the hypostasy of humanity, united but not mixed, perfectly distinct yet perfectly united in one prosopon, which is a person. So two natures, one person.
United, yeah.
And perfectly united. So that's the hypostatic union.
Yeah.
Not one doesn't assume the other, one doesn't become the other, one doesn't diminish the other. The only thing you could say is that, according to the kind of final council, which is Leo the Great, is another one that people should read. Leo is very pastoral, and his letters are just beautiful, especially in the Tome of Leo, where he lays this out quite clearly.
And this isn't a Pope Leo. It
is the Pope Leo.
Oh, it is a Pope Leo.
It is a Pope. Yeah, the Pope Leo in the middle of the 5th century. So the Council of Chalcedon was finally was figured out and nailed down in 451. So that took a long time to argue out, because they had an initial council where they decided against both Nestorius and Cyril, called the Robber Council of Ephesus, and that was eventually overturned at the Council of Chalcedon. And that's where the creed comes out, the Chalcedonian Creed, saying we have two natures, two hypostases in one prosopon, one person, and that's the person of Jesus. And then, later you still had, well, does he have two wills, right?
Yeah.
The argument kind of kept going.
Yeah, we've ended up with three, I think. I think a lot of people say there's three wills now these days.
There's probably. So the argument just, it quelled the big disturbances between the East and the West, but the brewing divide was already happening. It's funny for us Protestants to look so much back on the 95 Theses as such a big thing that defines the split between Protestants and Catholics. But even bigger than that was the East-West split that kind of culminated in 1051, I think it was. Something like that.
There's a couple of things to finish on that I've kind of gleaned or learned from this. One of them, I think, and I'm sure I'd love to hear briefly your thoughts on this, is that I think that Protestants need to be more comfortable at being in a state of mystery, or
Yes.
being willing to embrace mystery.
In that sense,
would
we're
you agree
just
with
as
that?
bad as the Catholics, right? Like, well, we're just trying to define everything ad nauseum. Like,
Sure.
there's no way you can't know everything. Just let it
I mean,
go.
like you said, they get more nitpicky over time
Yes,
with, you know,
yes.
with these councils. They, you know, it's burrowing deeper and deeper and deeper into
Yeah.
the minutiae of the details.
Yeah, and the Protestants have largely, we do the same thing. You know, it's how many denominational splits because of
Yeah.
that.
Sure. And the other thing is that, what's your opinion on Protestants as it claiming that tradition? Do you think we can rightfully claim to be a part of this long line of tradition? Because I think Catholics try to, and even Orthodox to an extent, try to sort of say, well, this is our tradition, and we kind of, the Church Fathers is our thing, and you guys have your own thing. But I feel like we could do better at taking ownership of some of this long
for
line
sure.
of tradition of thinkers.
Yeah, I think so, 100%. And you know as well as I do that Calvin and both Calvin and Luther, you know, kind of the main reformers, right? They were very influenced by the early church fathers, and Calvin directly calls back to a lot of Augustine, left, right, and center. And people make that argument back
Sure.
and forth. I know Leighton Flowers argued with some other guy on, you know, everybody likes arguing on YouTube. Right? That's why you got the two things you're not supposed to talk about podcast.
Yeah, well, I was going to say Leighton Flowers. I think I couldn't even begin to imagine how many debates he's taken part in. Kind of like
that's right.
James
Yeah.
White as well. Like how many
Yeah,
debates
that's
has
right.
James
Yeah,
White
that's
done in
right.
his life?
That's
Well,
right.
it's been a thoroughly fascinating conversation, and you know, I'm
I agree,
sure
Josh.
it would be great to maybe go deeper into some of these things again in the future, because I've really enjoyed, you know, just getting a beginner's guide to some of the sheer depth of stuff that's out there that we can. Stuff
There
is
is a
not
lot,
really
yeah, there is
stuff
a
is
lot.
not a good word to use. Just like
Yeah.
wisdom and
Yeah.
you know, insight, because you know it's you know.
But
it's
our goal in what well, my goal at least in what I do is I try and help people discover these things, and like you're saying, the 17-year-old that you want to point in the healthy direction. Well, let's help you discover these things. And so I've done a lot of writing on the Desert Fathers and the Desert Mothers. You can go to our website, windministries.ca, and find a number of those things. We have a podcast called Voices from the Desert where we talk through some of these things. I've written, as I showed the Silent Fire collection, thoughts on the early church fathers, Desert Fathers, and Desert Mothers. I'll flash this one up too, and you can
Yeah,
talk about
absolutely.
doing a giveaway
Please
for
do.
both of them if you'd like. The Transformation book, it's called Transformation, Catching a Glimpse of the Beauty of God. And I'm thoroughly convinced that that's what the early church fathers would have said was the life of transformation, was catching a glimpse of the beauty of God. And so there is actually a quarter of the book is footnotes, quotes, footnotes, thoughts from early church fathers, left, right. I mean, it's full of quotes because I just wanted to present.
We love
like,
that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
let's do a really good job representing what they said.
Of course, yeah.
So that's what we try and do, and I love what you're doing, Josh, bringing people together to talk about things that, you know, like, oh, this, and even just this, right? Like,
Yeah.
I grew up in a world where Catholics were evil. We didn't know that there even existed a thing called the Orthodox, and the Anglicans were kind of like bastardized Catholics,
Yeah.
and we should probably reject all of them because they all worship Mary,
And they all wear skirts.
and they all, yeah, exactly. And I've just found in my life that if I carry that idea too far, I will fail to learn some really, really vital things that will
Yeah.
be helpful in my life.
Yeah, I totally agree. And then coming from Northern Ireland, you know, that's the
Yeah.
place where Catholics, you know, on one side Catholics are totally evil, and the other side Protestants are totally evil.
That's right.
And
PEI
probably-
was like that until about 40 or 50 years ago.
Wow. There's probably part of that that's influenced my thinking on this, where I think someone said recently on a show that I recorded that it's not about gray in terms of like just trying to melt everything together, but it's about embracing the black and the white and kind of learning from each of those things. And
That's
I think
right.
that's, you know, what we can do, not just in politics, but with church traditions. And, you know, like I said, I've enjoyed listening. I say to people, and it probably worries them, that I probably listen to more Catholic thinkers than Protestant these days, because I'm getting a new flavor on things.
I
and-
agree.
And it's just trying to.
I grew up hearing all the Protestant thinkers. Let me hear
Yeah.
some new thoughts.
Yeah. So Saint Rick Warren was, you know, I've got that down to I've got that down to a T. So it's time to, you know, maybe look at some other saints in history.
Yeah, that's right.
But it's you know, I think at this point I'm at the stage where, you know, like we said earlier, we can discern, what's helpful, discard what is
Yeah,
not
that's
helpful,
right.
and
That's
at
right.
least, we're more aware of it. But yeah, I would just want to thank you again for joining me, and
Yeah, thanks for having
hopefully
me on.
hopefully we can do it again
Yeah,
sometime. And yeah, thank you to
absolutely.
everyone who's watched as well, and anyone that's tuned in. Please make sure you subscribe if you enjoy this
That's right.
conversation, and make sure you do that so you can watch any follow up conversations that we have
That's
and
right.
any other
Tell all your friends
episodes.
about the two
Yeah.
things that you shouldn't talk about.
Absolutely. If you have any suggestions, put them in the comments below. And Josh, if you have any, you can message me privately as
Yeah,
well,
yeah,
because
yeah,
I'm always
yeah.
open to new things. But that's all for this week, sadly, because it's one of those episodes that I wish didn't have to end so soon. But unfortunately, we're at the end. But thanks so much for watching, and make sure you tune in next time for another episode of the two things you shouldn't talk about.